Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Hello and welcome to Safeguarding Conversations. I'm Sam and today we're talking about the government's new Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, Freedom from Violence and Abuse, published in December 2025. It's a document that carries a lot of expectation, not just because of what it says, but because of how long it took to arrive and the context in which it's landed. This isn't emerging in a vacuum. It follows years of campaigning, rising reporting of sexual violence, growing concern about online misogyny, and widespread frustration that previous strategies didn't translate into lived change for women and girls. So, Sarah, let's start with the headline framing. Violence against women and girls is described explicitly as a national emergency. Now, that's a strong and deliberate choice of language.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it reflects something campaigners have been saying for years, that the scale, frequency and severity of harm simply haven't been matched by the seriousness of the response. So calling it an emergency acknowledges this, that it isn't marginal or exceptional, it's systemic.
Yeah, but I find myself asking governments, what do they actually do differently when something is labelled an emergency? Because in theory, emergencies demand urgency, coordination, and extraordinary measures.
Yeah, and that's where the skepticism comes in. Survivors don't experience change through language, they experience it through access to safe housing, timely justice, responsive services, and being believed. So without those things shifting, the word emergency risks becoming symbolic rather than operational.
So the framing raises the stakes, but it also raises expectations. Another significant move is the emphasis placed on shared responsibility. And this strategy repeatedly stresses that violence against women is not just a matter for police and courts.
And I think that's an important correction. Harm doesn't originate at the point of arrest. It's shaped long before that, in families, schools, online spaces, workplaces, and through social norms, that normalise or excuse abuse.
But shared responsibility is also tricky territory.
I think it really is. In safeguarding, we know that when responsibility is everyone's, it can quietly become no one's. Unless roles are clearly defined and unless there's a mechanism for holding different parts of government to account, diffusion of responsibility is a real risk.
So the ambition is right here, but the execution will determine whether this becomes a whole system response or a loosely connected set of intentions. Well, let's talk about prevention, Sarah. So prevention's positioned as central to long-term change, particularly through education around consent and healthy relationships.
Yeah, and I think most people working in this space agree that prevention matters deeply.
Yeah.
Challenging harmful norms early can make a real difference, especially for children who may not see healthy relationships modelled elsewhere.
Yeah. But there's also a danger of over-reliance on schools as the solution, Sarah.
Absolutely. Schools can open conversations, but they can't counteract an entire culture on their own. If young people leave a lesson on consent and then spend hours immersed in online spaces that reward misogyny, coercion and entitlement, the message becomes fragmented.
So education, it's crucial, it's necessary, but it's insufficient on its own, isn't it?
Yeah, prevention work only works when the wider environment reinforces it rather than undermines it. And that brings us, I think, to online harms, which many critics see as one of the strategy's weakest points. And that criticism, I think it feels justified. The strategy acknowledges the problem, but acknowledgement isn't regulation. Young people are navigating unregulated digital spaces every day, spaces that shape their understanding of gender, sex, and power.
And what worries me is the time lag here. Policy moves slowly, but technology moves fast.
It absolutely. Delay isn't neutral. Every year that effective regulation is postponed, another cohort of young people is exposed to harmful content without meaningful safeguards. And in that context, prevention efforts elsewhere are constantly playing catch up.
So the strategy also talks more explicitly about perpetrators, specialist police teams, and disrupting harmful behaviour.
Yeah, and I think that's a real welcome shift. For too long, safety messaging has focused on what women and girls should do differently rather than why violence is being allowed to continue.
Yeah, I agree. But again, there's a tension, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. A strong focus on criminal justice risks, reinforcing a reactive model. If intervention happens primarily after harm, then we're always dealing with damage rather than prevention.
And violence rooted in equality, entitlement, and power can't be policed away on its own.
No, and support for victims and survivors is one of the strongest elements of the strategy. There's a recognition that systems themselves can be traumatizing.
Yeah, and that acknowledgement really matters. Survivors often describe the process of seeking help as exhausting, fragmented, and really traumatizing.
So I think better coordination could genuinely improve experiences, but only if services are adequately resourced. It's that time old thing again. Otherwise, coordination just means managing scarcity more than efficiency.
And scarcity is already the reality for many frontline services. So that brings us to funding, doesn't it? The government's committed over 550 million over 3 years, and on paper, that sounds substantial.
Yeah, but in context, it's far less reassuring. Years of underinvestment means services are stretched to breaking point. Short-term funding keeps organisations in survival mode, unable to plan, retain staff or develop services sustainably.
So the question isn't just how much money is allocated, is it? It's, but how it's structured and whether it provides stability. Another reoccurring critique is about whose experiences are centred in the strategy.
Yeah, and I think this is really crucial. If the strategy doesn't meaningfully address the experiences of migrant women, women who are marginalised, those facing sort of multiple structural barriers, then equality gets reproduced within the response itself.
Yeah, which undermines the claim that this is a strategy for all women and girls.
So that brings us, I think, to a key question, is this a turning point or a missed opportunity?
Well, right now, it feels like a moment of possibility rather than resolution. That's my opinion.
Mhm.
The tone has shifted, the problem is named more honestly, and the ambition is clearer than before.
But ambition isn't protection, only delivery is.
Yeah.
Sustained funding, accountability, effective regulation of online harms, and a willingness, I think, to confront uncomfortable structural issues, which, they will determine whether this strategy makes a real difference.
Whether this becomes a turning point, I think, will depend on what happens long after this launch when attention moves elsewhere. So, thanks for listening to Safeguarding Conversations. We'll continue to follow how policy translates or fails to translate into lived safety on this topic. Thanks for listening, and please do give us a like and share. It really does help. And I hope you'll join us for the next in the series. Thanks for listening.